Hi, welcome back to Live and Transparent. Today's episode, we are going over chapter 8 and chapter 9 of the book of the life book based on Mark, and we are actually halfway through. So if you guys are following along, we are on page 44.
Yeah, so last time we ended with Jesus healing a deaf man, and now he's still continuing to with his miracles. So now we are seeing that Jesus feeds the 4,000. If you guys remember, we kind of had read a similar story like this. So basically, once again, a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat. And Jesus said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have had nothing to eat. And once again, Jesus keeps demonstrating his compassion all the time. And his disciples, they, so crazy because they had seen this, but now, get this, now the disciples are like, how can one feed these people with bread here? You know, they were like, how are you going to feed them? And it's kind of like the other story too, because in the other story they were like, how are we gonna feed them? We have nothing. And Jesus asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7. So they had more loaves than the other time, because last time it was 5,000 people and they had 5 loaves and 2 fish, and this time it's 4,000 people and they have 7 loaves. And what I wrote here was that the disciples had already seen Jesus feed 5,000. And this is another incident, you know, it's like a similar instance, and they still question. They're still questioning, you know, they're like, there's still that sense of doubt. And it's kind of like they forgot what Jesus had previously done.
Yeah, it was like they've seen it, they experienced it, and yet they were like, oh, like,
what now?
Yeah, like what?
Yeah. And I feel like instead of like them asking how can we feed these people, their response should have been like, Jesus did it, he can do it again.
Yeah.
But no, they were like, no, you know, how is this even possible? And Jesus, he took the 7 loaves and he gave thanks and he gave them to his disciples so they could give them to people. And once again, we see that all of the crowd, they ate and were satisfied, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. So they ended up with more than what they had to begin with. That's just the prosperity of Jesus there.
That's crazy. Imagine not having enough and then having left over for everyone. Like,
yeah,
take it for tomorrow.
Yes.
So then we move on to where the Pharisees demand a sign from Jesus. So they began to ask him, like, if you have done so many miracles, and like do another miracle right now, a bigger miracle than all the miracles that you've done. And he was like, he said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them and he went on the boat. And I was saying actually how I wrote here that Jesus didn't perform his miracles to convince people that he was Jesus. He was performing his miracles to demonstrate and really show
his compassion
and the power of God too. Mm-hmm. He wasn't doing it to show off or to be like, did you guys see what I just did? Like, no, he was doing it out of the kindness of his heart and like
out of love and grace. Yeah, and the Pharisees were just like, basically they were trying to provoke Jesus, and they had bad intentions in the way of temptations, and it like Jesus, like, he knew their intentions, so that's why he didn't, like, you know, do what they asked of him. And what Melanie just read, like, why does this generation seek a sign? There's a worldly concept that we see so much, and it's, I won't believe it until I see it. But we have to have that perspective of, no, I have faith in Jesus, and I don't necessarily have to see anything to believe in Jesus.
Yeah. And then so we move on to the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. So Jesus was like, he was on the boat. He was like, what happened? Like, did you guys not see me perform this same miracle like a few weeks back? Or like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then they were like, well, no.
Yeah. And this was all because they had no bread. So they were like, we have no bread, we have nothing.
Yeah.
And then that's when
he was like, what are you guys doing? What are you guys talking about?
Yeah.
When they were discussing, like Ashley said, that they didn't have any bread. So then Jesus, he was like, what the heck? And then he came and he was like, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? He was like, I just did it. Like,
yeah, I keep doing it.
And you guys keep not believing?
Yeah.
And he said, "Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, having many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And then they were like, "Oh, 12."
Yeah. And I guess what I wrote here too was that Jesus was confronting the disciples, like you just said, because it seems as like they don't learn.
Yeah.
They don't learn. They keep seeing and they don't learn. And Jesus constantly shows the disciples his faithfulness, but they look past it, and that's just what you read. Like, do you not remember?
I feel like Jesus was in a way like frustrated. I feel like you can really tell his tone of voice in this. Like,
yeah. And I wish we could have a recording of the way that Jesus
I imagine Jesus pacing around and be like, "Come on, what the
yeah." But all of this he did with the intention of love. Yeah. And the disciples, like I just said, they seem to often forget of the many miracles of Jesus.
And then he said again, "Do you not yet understand?" He was like, "Come on, guys, please."
Yeah. That's crazy because I guess you don't know, maybe the disciples were getting used to the many miracles of Jesus, or maybe their unfaithfulness and their doubtfulness is what caused them to not truly understand and not remember. But Jesus here, he was like, I've done so many things and you still don't really understand. Like come on.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, get it together. Come on. It was like a wake up call, I guess you could say, for them. And now we go to Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida. And some people brought to him a blind man and they begged him to touch him. And Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" Jesus was asking this blind man, okay, I already put my hands on you. And now he's asking, a simple question, "Do you see anything?" And this man, he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. So here, this is a different type of healing. It's a healing that we hadn't really seen before. It's a progressive manner.
Yeah.
And many people reading this story, they assume that Jesus made a mistake because instantly the man wasn't healed. But that's not the case. Jesus does everything with perfection. He does everything with a purpose and with an intention. And a progression was used in this case to help grow the man's faith and even courage. Because I was meditating on this story, right? And I thought about this one instance, and it's kind of funny because I was in the Starbucks drive-thru, right? And I ordered my usual, and I was like, "Yeah, give me an iced matcha." And I was like, I'm gonna get a venti. So I was like, "Give me an iced matcha venti." I get to the window, and they have a completely different drink, and I'm like, "What is this?" In my head. But I took it, and I was like, "Okay, fine, whatever. I'll just deal with it." And here, when Jesus asked him, "Do you see anything?" This man could have been like, "Yeah, I see perfectly fine." Oh my gosh, yeah, it's like. But no, he was like, "I see people, but they look like trees." So even there, it shows the courage that this man had to build up, because it does show courage. I think if I was that man, I would have been like, "Yes, I see everything." Yeah, but no, this man, his faith and his courage grew within the progressive manner, within the process. And even there's another point too that I was thinking about last night when I was reading this. This man could have gotten mad. This man could have been like, "They told me you would heal me. They told me you could do this, and I can't see." There could have been different reactions that this man could have had. There could have been the reaction of, him lying and saying, "I see fine, thank you." Or there could have been the reaction of him being mad, "Why didn't you heal me instantly?" And I also kind of begin to think that when we seek something of God, we always want it instantly. But this man had to there was a little steps that he had to take. And then this man I like the way that this man responded, because he was like, "You know what? I see people, but they look like trees."
He was being honest.
He was being honest and open and vulnerable with God, which is what you constantly have to do. And then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly because the man was honest, vulnerable, and open.
He was patient with his own process.
With Jesus. And yesterday I wrote this, and I was thinking, and it's that many people are walking around half healed because they didn't have the faith to let Jesus finish the work. This man could have gone half healed. He could have been like, yeah, I see perfectly fine, whatever, moving on, But no, he said, you know what? I can't see that well. And Jesus was like, thank you for your honesty, for your vulnerability, for just having that relationship with me and having that connection with me to tell me that you can't see. Jesus knew that he couldn't see. He knew, and he was like, let's see what happens. And this man was like, I can't see. And then Jesus touches him again, and now he's able to see. And now he goes completely healed, completely blessed.
I feel like a lot of people do that, where sometimes they're ashamed of what they might be ashamed of, like, oh, like, he didn't do it, like, all the way, like, or because of their own unfaithfulness and their own faith, they were healed not completely, and they might have been, like, ashamed. Where it has happened to me, where my faith hasn't been strong enough, and I'm ashamed that my faith wasn't strong enough.
Yeah.
And now I'm too ashamed to go back and be like, hey, you know what, like.
No, and that makes sense. But this man, he was just like, he was honest, and that's something
straightforward.
That's something that we have to be with our relationship with God. Be honest, be like, no, you know what, this and this. And this man, he had the courage and the faith, And now we go to Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. And Jesus was walking with his disciples, and he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? Jesus obviously knew, but, he was like, okay, let's see what they say. And the disciples told him John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And now there's a change of question. Now Jesus asked them, but who do you say that I am? And there's a difference between who other people thought Jesus was and who his disciples thought he was, because his disciples were the one that was always with him, the ones that knew Jesus directly. And Peter answered him, and he was right on the mark. He was like, you are the Christ. He was like, you are the Christ. And Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about him.
That's crazy. Again, that's something we see over and over throughout his miracles, where he's like, go on, don't tell anyone, or like, keep it to yourself and stuff like that. So we move on to the next part, where this is one of the first times that Jesus foreshadows his own death. And he was teaching the disciples, and he was telling them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests. And he tells them that he must be killed, and after 3 days he will rise again. And after he said this, Peter was like startled. He was like, what? Like, no, like, what are you doing? What are you saying right now? Like,
yeah.
And he started to rebuke him. But turning to the disciples, Jesus said to Peter, go behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man.
Yeah, there's so much wrapped in this. Like, first of all, Jesus is telling them everything that has to happen to him. And he said this plainly. He was like, you know what? I can imagine them like, this is like a regular conversation with a friend, this is going to happen. Like, it's like when you're planning, like, let's go out, let's do this. And he was like saying that, like, this is going to happen to me. I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be mocked. And Peter couldn't believe it, because and it's crazy because we just read that Peter was, he said, you are the Christ. And now he's rebuking Jesus. And it's like, okay, like, what happened in between that? But I was telling Melanie that the Messiah is seen, as the most highest, as the one that has to be holy, as the one that symbolizes strength. And Jesus obviously symbolized all of this. But by Jesus saying that he must be killed, that he was going to be rejected, it like didn't make sense to Peter. It's like, you're saying you're the Messiah, but you're going through all of this, like, it doesn't make sense. And that's where Jesus said, you are not setting your mind on things of this world, because Peter rebuking Jesus didn't align with scripture, because it was already previously said that this must happen. But Peter wasn't on the same, I guess, well, obviously we're not on the same level of Jesus, but like, he just didn't comprehend.
Yeah. I mean, I think we said a few episodes back, if we were in his shoes, we would have done the same thing.
Yeah. Because you're like,
this doesn't make sense. You're like, like, why would you do that? Like, why would that happen to you if you're the Messiah?
Yeah.
And so then Jesus goes on to tell the disciples in the crowd, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.
And Jesus is like clear on what we have to do as followers.
Yeah. He's like telling us like this is what you have to do and this is what you have to do. And it's up to us to do that or not to.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, for whoever will save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. And that's very powerful. And he's saying this to the disciples and the crowd that's following him. So he's telling them what to do, and he's like, well, you guys have to do this.
Yeah, and he's saying that the gospel is worth it. You know, it's worth living for Jesus.
Yeah. And then we move on to chapter 9.
Yeah. So then here we see the Transfiguration. And after all of this happened, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. And Jesus was transfigured before the disciples. And he was like transformed right in front of them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. So like it was just like just the glory of God, like just shown to them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. So here I asked, one of the questions that I have always asked was like, why Elijah and Moses? And it's because they were both people that represented God in a very good way because of what they had done and what they did. And Peter couldn't understand, and I was reading yesterday that Peter was like a very open person, because first he's like the first one to answer, you are the Christ, and then he's starts rebuking Jesus, and now he's saying, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, for he did not know what to say. Peter's always like the first one to speak out.
Yeah. And
the other disciples, John, James, they were also terrified. I can't imagine they knew that Elijah and Moses were dead way past their time because it was the Old Testament, and now they're seeing them there and Jesus is talking to them. You're like, what? You're terrified because you're like, I've never seen this before. Like, what's going on? What's happening? And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, and the voice said, "This is my beloved son. Listen to him." So there's a couple of things to from here. And first of all, the cloud represents the glory of God, because in the Old Testament, a cloud would always follow the Israelites and direct them. If they were, Jesus would always be represent his glory with a cloud. And then also, this part is very impactful, and I love it that it says, "This is my beloved son," because by saying my beloved son, it was a confirmation and assurance for the disciples. It was like, he's telling you that he is the Messiah and he is the Christ. So listen to him. And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone but Jesus only. So I can't imagine the disciples' thought process. They were probably so confused. Yeah. And when they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus told them not to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And also, I don't think anyone would have really believed them. They would have been like, you're crazy. That couldn't have happened. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. But we had just read, that this is basically, once again, foretelling his death and resurrection.
Yeah, he's kind of preparing the way for the disciples to not be so I guess left alone in a way that they didn't know what to do after.
Mm-hmm. And so dependent on him, because this next story we see how it's in a way Jesus was giving them all the resources. He was giving them all the tools. He was
preparing them.
And they just needed to truly understand and take a grasp of what Jesus was telling them to do and commanding them to do.
Yeah. And so we move on to the next story, where Jesus heals a boy with an unclean spirit. And here the disciples were trying to cast out a demon from this boy, but they weren't able to. So then Jesus came and he was like, what are you guys arguing about with them? And so then the father came to him and said, teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And then he went on to say, so I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able to do so. And then Jesus said to them, O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me.
Yeah, that's a crazy start of the story, because the disciples, they had the authority of Jesus, yet they couldn't cast out this demon because, like Jesus said, faithless generation.
Yeah.
And even in that statement, like, how long am I to bear with you? And how long am I to be with you? He like just keeps saying, like, come on, the time is coming where I have to, like, fulfill the scriptures of my death and resurrection.
Yeah, in a way, I feel like Jesus was kind of becoming more like come on, the time's running out. Like,
Yeah.
you need to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw that it was Jesus, he immediately was thrown down.
Yeah, and that just shows the intensity of, like, this demon.
Mm-hmm.
He tried to do the most harm even while Jesus was there, but, like, he couldn't do enough because Jesus was there.
Yeah. And so then Jesus was like, how long has this been happening to him? And the father said that it had been happening since he was just a kid, since he was like all his life. And that he even tried like jumping into fire and into water to just couldn't end it all. And the father of the boy said to him, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And that's like I guess that's the very first step of like being like, you know what, I need you.
Yeah.
You're the only thing that can help us, right?
Yeah. But also that if is a huge word, because there's a sense of doubt and possibilities that are open and that can occur there.
And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for the one who believes.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe. Help my unbelief.
I love that. Like, when I was reading that yesterday, I was like, I highlighted and circled everything. I was like, I love that statement. Like, I believe, help my unbelief, and it's impactful because the man recognized that he believed, but he was still lacking a little bit of faith, and he knew that he needed the help of Jesus, and that man had a desire, he had a goal, and he was like, I need you to help my unbelief. And I feel like that's something that we should constantly apply in our lives, like, yes, we believe, but help that little bit of unbelief that I have in my life.
Yeah. And so then Jesus went on to say, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And when he said that, the boy started convulsing terribly. And when the spirit came out, the boy seemed like he was dead. Mm-hmm. They were like, well, he looks like a corpse. He's not moving. He's not doing anything. But then Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And then the disciples were like, why were we not able to cast it out? Mm-hmm. And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out but by anything but prayer.
Yeah, and I wrote here on the side, you always have to be ready. This is something that we hear in church, like, you always have to be ready. You always have to be ready. And being ready requires being right with God, in prayer, reading your Bible, fasting and communication. That's something that God was telling them. He was like, I gave you that Jesus was telling him, he was like, I gave you the authority, but you were lacking prayer and you were lacking fasting. You were lacking the most important things, because anything Christianity life, anything like you have to always back it up with prayer. Mm-hmm. You can't live life without prayer. You can't go on with your day without a prayer. You can't. So that was required in this instance. Mm-hmm. And now we go to Jesus again foretells death and resurrection. This is the second time we see it now. And Jesus said, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. Jesus tells them what has to take place. This has to happen. And the disciples did not understand, and they were afraid to ask Jesus. They couldn't picture the process that Jesus was going to have to go through. Mm-hmm. It was it is a inhumane process. You know, it was a process that is hard to picture.
Yeah, I imagine just like being with the Messiah for like forever, and then just him telling you like, you know, like I'm gonna die,
Yeah.
but I'm gonna come back. And imagine the thought process of being like, wait a minute, you're gonna die and then you're gonna come back? Like,
Yeah, like you don't understand. And then we go on to who is the greatest. And the disciples were like, you know, talking among themselves, and Jesus was like, what were you guys discussing on the way? You know, he asked them. And they kept silent because they were ashamed of what they were talking about, you know. And because they were arguing with one another about who was the greatest, you know, between them. They were like, oh, no, because I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest, I'm this, I'm the greatest. And Jesus said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And here, like I was telling Millie, like Jesus could have instantly been like, I'm the greatest, obviously. You know, but here he was basically describing his characteristics, that if anyone would be first, he must be last and servant of all, because Jesus was always serving. You know, he was always a servant. And I wrote here, to be like Christ means you serve. And Jesus was telling them, like, you know, you have to serve it. You have to, like we said right now, deny yourself, to take up your cross and serve.
And so this next part, it's a really good part, and it's when John said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and you tried to stop them, but they were not following us." So I felt like John was like, "Did you see them? Like they were doing it too, like, and they weren't even with us. Like they were using your name, you know, kind of like a tattletale."
Yeah, because I guess he was like, no, only we can do that. You know,
he felt greater than yeah. So then Jesus went on to say to them, do not stop him, for the one who is against us is for us. Like, and he said everything with one simple, like, he was like...
That basically wrapped everything up, you know, saying, like, you know, if you believe, like, Jesus also gives you the authority, you know, like he had just done to the disciples. And it's not like the gospel was just designated for the disciples, and it was just like they could only, like, you know, pray, or they could only cast demons. No, it was for everyone who believes, and for everyone like that accepted the gospel.
Yeah. And then so we move on to the temptation to sin, and here's where Jesus says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to if a great millstone were hung around his neck and were thrown into the sea. So he's saying, like, it's better for you to do that than to make one of mine fall
and sin. Yeah, because like that's the worst thing, like causing anyone to sin. And it kind of goes to, like, you know, I guess you can relate it to peer pressure, like, come on, nothing's gonna happen, you only live once, you know. That's always you hear.
Always hear like that. When the enemy told Eve, like, you're not gonna die.
Yeah,
like kind of like in that same way.
And like you should never be the reason why someone, like, you know, falls into sin or temptation. You always have to be that person that is purified and holy and helps people.
Yeah. And he also says, if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than two eyes to be thrown in hell. So he's not saying, like, take your eye out, right?
It's not literal.
He's saying, like, if it's causing you to sin, then why are you going back to it?
Yeah, why are you still keeping it around you? Why are you still holding on to that?
Yeah. And then this last part is like I feel like it's the most impactful part for me. And it says, salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will it make you salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another.
And here the salt is us, you know, like we are described as the salt of this world. And to lose its saltiness is like we lose our purpose, what God has intended for us. And it's like, no, don't fall into temptations, don't fall into sin, but be the salt, be the difference, be the one who's holy, be the one who's pure, be the one who constantly follows Jesus, who does the right thing. It may not seem right to the world,
but it's right.
But it's right among God's eyes. And I also love this last part, and be at peace with one another. You know, at all times, be at peace with one another. And that was the end of chapter 8 and 9. Still so many miracles from Jesus, and so many like now we see that Jesus is foretelling.
Yeah, we're getting to the climax of the story.
Yeah, now we're getting to like
the
the intense part of the story. Yeah, but this is just, I just love this. Like rereading all of this makes me just like truly appreciate everything. So that was it, and thank you so much for listening or watching. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you. God bless.